You're someone with a vision for your practice, for your side hustle, and for your personal journey. But when it comes to establishing your path on how to get to where you want to be with your practice, things get a little messy. You're also someone who'd prefer to go in person instead of to groups and listening to everyone else's story. To me, it sounds like you could benefit from one-on-one consulting with our experienced practice of the practice consultants. From $5.95 a month and up, you can work with a consultant that will give you more direction and practical tried and tested tips matched to you and your goals. For more information, visit practiceofthepractice.com/apply. Again, that's practiceofthepractice.com/apply. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1227. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast. I hope you are doing awesome today. I hope your springtime is treating you well, and that maybe you have some trips planned or you're planning for summer coming up. It's really speeding along here. So I hope that things are great in your world. In this podcast, we help you build a thriving private practice you absolutely love. And part of that is to really dig into some issues and some topics that maybe we don't always dig into as deeply as we can do on a podcast. And that's why I'm so excited today to have Dr. Lissa Rankin, MD, who is a mind-body medicine physician, author of 7 books, and the founder of Whole Health Medicine Institute, and also the nonprofit Heal at Last. She's an artist who reaches radical remission, trauma-informed medicine, and spiritual healing. She teaches memoir writing for therapeutic purposes, in addition to being an educator of internal family systems. Her TEDx talks have been viewed over 6 million times, and she's starred in 2 national public television specials. Lissa, welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. It's always interesting when different things line up just personally with my life. So as we were talking before we started rolling, we were talking about all the different directions that we could go, as I do with every guest. We were talking about relational trauma, dysregulation of trauma and in the body. We talked about just like spiritual recovery. We talked about narcissists. I mean, there's a lot going on in your professional world that in the last few years I've dealt with through a divorce and through my own medical issues. So I hope you can solve it all for me today.
I have a bit of professional ADHD, as you can tell.
Well, I love that. Well, tell me about right now. What's some of the work that's lighting you up right now? I know part of it you might be working on, your future book that comes out in a year, and we don't have to dig too far into that. We'll have you back on the show, but tell us a little bit about just right now what's lighting you up, and then we can talk about kind of your broader scope of work.
Well, I'm working on my next book with my partner, Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. He's a Harvard psychiatrist. And so, that's a lot of our focus right now, is sort of working on trying to make sense of the physical health impacts, the nervous system dysregulation caused by relational trauma, particularly oppressive relationships or narcissistic relationships, with, people who give more than they receive in their relationships, and kind of have these non-reciprocal partnerships or work relationships and such, and get sick. And because we're both medical doctors, we're really interested. Both of us have been researching radical remission for, between the two of us, 33 years. And we were doing our research independently. We just met about 5.5 years ago and realized that both of us independently had come to the conclusion that people who had these sort of seemingly miraculous recoveries from quote unquote incurable medical conditions often had been in oppressive relationships and found a way to either change the way they showed up in the relationship or left the relationship. And then their bodies sometimes had very rapid recoveries. And we saw it over and over again. And so when we realized that we had both kind of made that, made that observation independently, we decided to write a book about it together. He called one of his patients called it the Selfish Bitch Project. And one of my patients called it becoming unfuckwithable.
Mm.
So it's like,
Both
oh,
great
there's a
titles.
whole
How are you guys going to name this book?
we don't know. Every this is my eighth book, and every one of my books, like the title came to me first, and then I had to build the book from the title. And this is the opposite. It's like I've built the book, I'm almost done with it, and I still don't know what the title is.
Mm. Well, I'm sure it'll come to you. I mean, those are two great titles right there. So, yeah, they definitely would stand out in the market.
Yeah, they don't want the
Well, it,
Selfish Bitch Project because it's also for men. Men absolutely
mm,
wind up in, and so, and becoming unfuckwithable. Well, maybe.
yeah, I mean, I think it was Marie Forleo that had a book. I forgot what it was called, but it had a really like abstract word that her grandma had said. Like everything, what is it? Everything is. I'll have to look it up and I'll bring it back in the episode. But that idea of the relationship informing your body seems to go
Yeah.
against on the surface so much of what Western medicine has taught us. Tell me what you see actually happening in the body, being a doctor, being in this work, doing research, in communities, and your partner as well. um, what are you seeing that maybe challenges that Western model of the body and the relationships being very separate from one another?
Yeah, well, my clinical work with that all began in back in 2009 when I had left the hospital and I started an integrative medicine practice, just a cash pay integrative practice so that I could spend a full hour with my patients. And by the time these patients came to see me, I had just moved to Marin County, which for any of you who don't know it, it's like Health Nut Central. And I had been working on the front lines in, really high risk populations in the inner city of Chicago. I was working with Somali refugees on the Mexican San Diego border. I was their OBGYN, and many of them had female genital mutilation. So, really high risk populations. And then I moved to Marin um, and opened this sort of practice for the privileged. And these people had seen the best doctors at UCSF and Stanford, and they'd seen their acupuncturist and their naturopath, and they were taking 100 supplements and working out with their personal trainer and eating their raw vegan diet. And they were literally the sickest people I'd ever seen.
Mm,
And it didn't make any sense to me. And so, kind of the results of my observations there were published in Mind Over Medicine, which is the New York Times bestselling book that I wrote that got turned into a public television special. And the relational aspects of that were really evident from the very beginning there, that many of these people, since I was a gynecologist, I was just seeing women, and many of these women were married to these, Silicon Valley CEOs, really wealthy, really successful, really narcissistic individuals. And they were being coercively controlled in these relationships. And when we were doing some of the trauma screening and then trauma recovery work, sometimes their symptoms would be going away in like 3 months. And they
mm,
credited me, and I wasn't doing anything. I was just asking good questions. So that kind of began a whole area of my interest and research into uh, the relational impacts on the physical body. I did a TEDx talk about loneliness as a public health issue, and was working with our current Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who, right at the beginning of the pandemic, sort of announced loneliness as a public health issue and wrote a book called Together. And then, boom, we're in social isolation in 2020 in lockdown. Um, so I'm interested in it in sort of the personal to the collective level of, basically relationships can be medicine or poison to our bodies, depending on how they impact our nervous systems. In fact, that's one of the working titles is medicine or poison, you know,
mm,
how relationships can make you sick or help you heal. And so, that's been a lot of what I've looked at, particularly through the internal family systems model, is how do we make our relationships medicine? Um, and I'm really interested in sort of the polyvagal theory um, aspect of that, sort of a lot of people with severe trauma, their safety danger compasses are backwards, and they feel safe around dangerous people, and they feel threatened around safe people. And so reorienting that compass. And so, of course, that creates even more trauma when you feel safe around dangerous people, you're going to just build on the trauma. The relational trauma is going to get worse over time as you continue to choose unsafe people to get close with. So, you know, those, and then of course that leads to loneliness because then people become so frightened of relationships because their compass is backwards.
Hmm. And how does IFS kind of intersect with that polyvagal theory and kind of what you're talking about is happening in the body?
Yeah, well, so from the polyvagal perspective, we're looking at attachment styles, right? Attachment relationships. And when we have a healthy, secure attachment style, then we're able to be in that ventral vagal, um, socially connected, tend and befriend, natural self healing aspect of the nervous system that is really good for the body's recovery. It's really good for mental health recovery. It's really good for physical recovery. And so when we look at internal family systems, we're doing parts work. We're looking at the parts, for example, that prevent us from being in a ventral vagal parasympathetic state, in that natural self healing state. So, for example, if we're dissociated because of relational trauma, then we're disembodied, we're dissociated. These are parts, of course, that will put us more in a um, dorsal vagal state of the nervous system, for example, the shutdown, collapse, the most severe threat, sort of the freeze or sometimes the fawn trauma response. And that is extremely, extremely detrimental to the body for the nervous system to be in that dorsal vagal state. And then, of course, we have sort of the middle state, the fight or flight sympathetic stress response, which again, also difficult for the body to engage in self healing when we're in fight or flight or when we're in freeze or fawn. And I love IFS as part of the antidote to that, of getting to know those parts, getting to know the parts that fight, getting to know the parts that flee, that freeze, and all of the constellations of parts inside that make up these different stress responses. And of course, part of the orientation of internal family systems is to reconnect and reunite these sort of disintegrated parts of us with what we call self energy in internal family systems, the sort of the part that's not a part, the aspect of being that can't be broken, that can't be traumatized, that is, if you have any spiritual inclination, every religion and spiritual community has a different name for, Christ consciousness, Buddha nature, your higher self, your divine spark, whatever you want to call it. In IFS, we call it self. And so that attachment relationship going internal between self and the wounded inner children or the protective parts that try to protect those wounded inner children can be part of reorienting those attachment relationships to create earned secure attachment that can lead to that ventral vagal parasympathetic response that will can sometimes quite quickly turn around certain kinds of physical illnesses depending on how long they've been there, how entrenched the damage is in the body. And it's just been really amazing to work with people in that way. I personally, at this point, think it's medical malpractice, for example, to give somebody oncology treatment without also doing a really thorough um, trauma screen, not just for adverse childhood experiences or ACE traumas, but for relational trauma, for developmental trauma, for heartbreak.
Hmm. It's so interesting how often guests on this show, it's like the universe, the energy, the self, the ego, whatever, is lining up these guests just to have me work on myself. uh, in 2021, I left a pretty toxic marriage, and my ex ran off with her surf instructor, and left
Oh
the kids with
no,
me, and they only see her maybe once a month. Um, I'm
I'm so
interested.
sorry.
Thank you. Um, I'm interested in, and I don't want to label her a narcissist. I don't know. I don't know enough about her to give her any labels, but I do know that, in retrospect, I gave up a lot of myself to be the over the overcompensating adult, the one that did a lot of the working, the like keeping track of the kids, and those sorts of things that you were mentioning, in regards to just
Yeah.
like
The
me overextending
overfunctioning.
myself, overfunctioning.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for.
Overfunctioning.
And it's like, so when someone can have a clean break with someone, that's one thing. But then, I want to the best of what her ability is, be a good co-parent.
Right.
And so for people that have to continue to deal with someone, like my therapist has talked a lot about gray rocking and like being as boring
Yep.
as a gray rock, and to just only give the information that's needed. The only thing we really have to talk about is the kids, their schedules, a handful of things, like that, like they left their coat, at your house, that kind of thing.
Yep.
What other
Or the
tips?
slightly more cheerful yellow rock. I don't know. Have you
Ooh,
heard
so
about that
tell me
one?
about Yellow Rock, and also tell me, like, what is a healthy way? Because it's interesting you bring up also the medical side, because I'm type 1 diabetic. That's been a long process that, I think, I ended up having thyroid cancer also. So there's something going on there, where they're connected in the endocrine system. But
Yeah.
slightly after everything resolved, with the divorce and all that, I got salmonella in Mexico, and 2.5 years later, I'm still dealing with that. And
Oh my gosh.
miraculously, a day after mediation and some things that were really big got solved, a lot of those symptoms just disappeared the next week. And it's like, as you say this, I'm like, WTF? Like,
That does
what is
not
happening?
surprise me. That
Right.
does
And
not
so
surprise me, Joe.
dissect that for me. Tell me what's going on.
Well, I'll go backwards a little bit. So the book that I'm working on now, the untitled mystery book, begins with the story of the giving tree. Did you ever get
Mm.
indoctrinated with this story when you were a child?
Yes, yes, I know that story well, but maybe for those that haven't heard it, if you could give a
Yeah.
summary, that'd be wonderful.
So sure, it's written by Silverstein, and Jeff and I, my partner and I, were both raised in pretty fundamentalist Christian churches, and
Mm.
I think it was
Oh.
common in some of those environments to sort of use this book as a way to teach good boys and girls, particularly good girls, how to behave in relationships. And so in this book, the tree is a female, and the boy is this young male. And the boy goes to the tree, and he wants to eat her apples and pick her fruit and enjoy her branches and climb all over her. And they have this very sweet relationship when he's a child, between the boy and the tree. And as he gets older, he gets less interested in the tree, but he's basically exploiting her over time. He comes back and she wants him to play on her branches and eat her apples. And he says, "No, I just want money." And she says, "Okay, well, you can take my apples and take them to the market and sell them." And so he does that. And then he comes back and she wants him to play. And he says, "No, I don't want to play, but I just want a house. Can you buy me a house?" And she's like, "No, but you can cut down my branches." And anyway, long story short, she ends up a dead stump. And he's an old man, like sitting on her. And we're supposed to believe that the tree is happy. The tree is happy
Mm.
from having been a sacrificial martyr that ends up dead.
Hmm.
And, we're pushing back against that. We don't want to like upset sacred cows,
Hmm.
Um, but that's what we both have seen in our medical practices over and over, is that these people that are just like, take everything in the name of unconditional love, and you don't have to be grateful and you don't have to give back. And of course, if you show up in the world that way, there are people that can be quite ruthless, that are more than happy to just be like the boy. They're more than happy to just take. And that might, again, a lot of spiritual and religious indoctrination kind of bolsters that. It like the thought processes will support that is what it means to be a good little Christian girl, for example.
Hmm.
Um, or even separate from the religious indoctrination, just the gender conditioning. That's what a female does in a patriarchal culture, for example. And of course, now that women have more power, there are more and more women that maybe are taking on the role of the boy, and men who are maybe acting more like the giving tree, like maybe in your situation. But what that story doesn't talk about is, what does that do to the nervous system to feel, yeah, to be exploited repetitively. And often people were exploited in childhood to set them up to think that's normal. So, yeah, we're really making a case for, one of the working titles of the book is an IFS term, which is U turn, YOU turn. Um, Sometimes we have to do that instead of putting all of our attention on the outside, coming back to the inside, into our parts, to be like, what do my parts inside need? And so it's not surprising to me that you went through that and all of the stress of the mediation and all of the conflict, especially for people that are more conflict avoidant because conflict was maybe dangerous or unsafe in their past lives or in their present lives. And then all of a sudden you take away all that conflict and the symptoms improve. That's not surprising.
Now you had said instead of gray rocking, I think it was yellow rocking also. Tell me about yellow rocking.
Yeah, yellow rocking is like gray rock, which basically just means like you're just boring. They can't get a rise out of you with positive or negative things because people who are higher on the narcissism spectrum or in IFS language have sort of a constellation of parts that kind of create the symptomatology of narcissism. They will get narcissistic supply even if the attention is negative. So even if they're just getting a big rise out of you, that is still attention if they're for their attention seeking parts. So they're not able to actually get much attention from you, no matter how egregious the behaviors, um, they get bored. So gray rocking is just being flat as a board, right? Flat as a rock, just
Hmm.
gray rock. Yellow rock is a little sunnier, because again, if you're co-parenting with somebody, you're going to have to see this person. Your kids are going to see you around them. It's just kind of gray rock with a smile, know, a fake smile, maybe. You're sort of gaslighting your own parts a little bit if you're doing that sometimes, but to just kind of keep the peace for the sake of the family. And that is one of the most difficult situations when it comes to how to deal with a relationship like that is when you can't go no contact. That's not an option. You have to, if you are co-parenting, then you have to face that person. And for a lot of people, even just the kids, the passing over of the kids is activating to the nervous system. So being able to work with the parts that, especially if there was any narcissistic abuse in the past in childhood, um, if sometimes if we can go back and kind of reclaim and heal and integrate and bring back into present time the parts from the past that may have been overpowered or oppressed, then at least those younger parts that are much more sensitive and reactive, if we can take care of those parts, then often the X is not so activating to the nervous system. So we do have some, we can't control how the X is going to behave, but we can have some agency over healing past narcissistic abuses, even in the relationship. The past might be 2021, not necessarily just childhood, but often people who choose relationships like that, there are multiple relationships that fit that pattern in the past. I don't know if that's your situation, but sometimes doing that IFS work on the wounded children inside of us that learned how to fawn or to overfunction or to take on responsibilities that really are not equal, not fair, and not yours. Um, that in and of itself is a trauma response, the sort of
Hmm.
fawning behavior.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting because in very few areas of my life do I do that, and I think that it's interesting because you talk about being raised in a um, pretty extreme version of Christianity. Or I forgot exactly how you phrased it, but I was raised Catholic and then became evangelical late in high school and went through a phase of that, and so took on a lot of that purity message. And I think that for
Yep.
me, being in a lot of ways a natural and cultivated leader, like I had a lot of great mentors, and I was always taught by my parents to stand up for myself. And even though I was getting these messages from Catholic school, my parents kind of undermined them at times too. And so I feel like in a lot of ways I had a very healthy and nuanced childhood where I could
Mhm.
speak up. And then it's like I got this message of like, the worst thing is to get divorced, and to admit that maybe you married the wrong person. And so it
Mm.
was everything I read was, I mean, I went through the Gottman certification and all
Oh,
these
yeah.
things, for myself and for my clients to because, okay, I need to do the 5-to-1 ratio. I need to recognize the 4 horsemen. I
Uh-huh.
need to do all these things that,
Uh-huh.
sex starts in the kitchen. Okay, I will make sure the kitchen's clean. And so it's like the achiever side of me, I think, is more
Sure.
what definitely came out, and just like, if I follow this formula, then it'll work out. More than kind of fawning over someone or being conflict avoided.
Yeah, I have a part like that too that's like, "Give me all the gold stars so I can get it right."
Exactly.
And
Well, my
yeah,
dad
I
is a
I
behavioral psychologist that worked in the schools, and one of my earliest memories, I was probably 3 years old, was finishing a star chart for going to bed correctly, and then going and buying a little kid's sword. And it's like, so much of that, my undoing has been realizing, they weren't just saying you're only loved for your achievement, even if that's what my takeaway was. I have my own therapy to work through with all that. But no, I get it. The gold stars for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's why one of the couples therapy models that I really respect and appreciate is Terry Reel's model, because he takes on, his a lot of couples therapy models basically treat the couple as kind of equals. Like, you're responsible for what's on your side of the street, and you're responsible for what's on your side of the street, and that doesn't necessarily acknowledge, for example, things like coercive control.
Mm,
Um, when one party is really disempowered and oppressed, and another party is very controlling and oppressive. Terry Reel's model, the relational life therapy, the therapist takes sides with the oppressed and stands up against the oppressor in a compassionate and trauma informed way. His specialty is kind of patriarchy and the narcissistic imbalances of power that can show up in romantic relationships. So that it's different because, again, I love the Gottman's work. My partner and I are actually reading their new book Fight right now,
mm.
which is great. It talks about the 5-to-1 ratio and all the things that you're
Mhm.
talking about there. Five positive ways of showing up in conflict, which I really appreciate because it's not just praise and cherish your partner. It's things like validate what they're saying, mirror and witness what they're experiencing, say good point or that's fair or, things like that to actually validate them when they're protesting something. Um,
Mm.
but some people that are high on the narcissism spectrum, they will fight that tooth and nail. They do not like to be held accountable. They don't like to admit when they're wrong. They struggle with expressing remorse or admitting when they've made mistakes. And they will pull all the narcissistic defenses, which again in IFS are parts. The DARVO, the deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, all the projection and displacement and blame shifting. And it can be very difficult if somebody doesn't have a lot of ego strength to be able to continue to sort of hold them to account. So sometimes in couples therapy, somebody needs to kind of have their side so that they don't just get bulldozed.
Mm. Listen, I didn't take insurance in my counseling practice because I had no idea how to handle it. The process of accepting insurance outside of a group practice can be tough, but most people looking for mental health care want to use their benefits to pay for sessions. If you're like me and you feel a little scared about taking insurance, or you just want to make it easier on yourself, and you're interested in seeing clients through insurance, Alma can help. They make it easy to get credentialed with major insurance plans at enhanced reimbursement rates. They also handle all the paperwork, from eligibility checks to claim submission and guaranteed payment within 2 weeks. Plus, when you join Alma, you'll get access to time-saving tools for intake, scheduling, treatment plans, progress notes, and more in their included platform. It's going to make it so much easier for your team, so you can spend less time on administrative work and more time offering great care to your clients. Visit helloalma.com/Joe. That's helloalma.com/Joe to get started. Now, before I ask the next question, I did look up that Marie Forleo book that has the unique title is "Everything is Figure Outable."
Oh, I like
So
that.
yeah, yeah. So that was a term that her grandma would say, and I couldn't remember at the beginning of the episode. Um, this last section, we've probably got 5 minutes or so left.
Okay,
I would
sure.
love to get a little bit more personal. So you said you and your partner were raised in a highly religious home. You've also talked about kind of a little bit of your own development in regards to reading together and things like that. I would love to take all this knowledge that you've learned and sort of like the doctor treat the doctor. So what do these habits look like for you? What's been helpful for kind of undoing and reforming the way that you were raised? Just like what does your weekly or monthly or yearly habits look like in regards to enacting these things that you're talking about?
No, that's a great question. I was lucky in that my religious indoctrination was much milder than my partner's. He was raised in the IBLP cult, and then ended up in an Eastern Orthodox cult. So he kind of went cult hopping, as people who were raised in cults often do. Mine was, I had three Methodist ministers in the family, and my mother's view of Christianity was very fundamentalist. But I had the other ministers in my family and other family members who were social justice activists and very liberal, and kind of pushed back against my mother. So I had other influences, and I left the church when I was 18 and have considered myself a spiritual being, but outside of any organized religion since I went to college. So for me, it was a lot easier. But I definitely had I shared with my partner the sort of trauma symptom of, spiritual bypassing, if you want to call it that, the spiritualized conflict avoidance, or conflict avoidance in holy drag, if you will.
Mm,
Um, in IFS, we call it self-like parts that sort of masquerade as self and kind of inflate us by, convincing us that we're extra spiritual, in the way that we avoid conflict. So I have been lucky to have really good therapy from both internal family systems and advanced integrative therapy, and then also relational life therapy with a couples counselor that Terry Real picked for Jeff and I. Um, and so part of my practice now that I'm in a partnership with somebody who was in an extremely oppressive situation is like we're doing a lot of relational healing, which, man, if you want to pursue your awakening path, like, go be a monk in a cave, and it's 1,000 times easier than trying to do it in a relationship. So,
hmm
but that's a path that is, maybe a quicker and more difficult path of recovery and awakening. That is definitely my preferred method. But for me, part of what that looks like at the sort of really practical level is I have a parts processing partner. Her name is Emma in the UK. We've been doing this for, I don't know, 7 years. I've been an IFS practitioner for over 10 years now, and an IFS teacher since 2019. And I wrote about it in Mind Over Medicine. I wrote about it in my last book, Sacred Medicine, and it's sort of the cornerstone of the sort of treatment aspect of the book that I'm working on now. So that daily IFS meditation practice of sort of going inside and checking with my parts, and then reporting on those parts with my parts processing partner, who then mirrors and validates my parts. And then she does her processing with me, and I mirror and validate her parts. She just got married last month and credits our parts processing practice with her ability to get married for the first time, um, to be able to have a successful marriage. And it's definitely been part of the practice of making me able to be in a relationship with somebody like Jeff, who is a severe trauma survivor. And, um, it's challenging when you're raised more securely attached and you're trying to attach to somebody with, in his case, disorganized attachment. Um, so I do my own personal practice. Like, I kind of think of it like fractals. It's like me inside with my parts, and then going outside in a therapeutic space with my parts processing partner. This is part of what I teach in my online programs now, is teaching people how to do parts to parts processing with another person as a form of relational healing and as a health equity kind of orientation, because it costs nothing for Emma and I to do this with each other. And we do it in between therapy sessions. And then, Jeff and I have our own practice. We do what we call cafe time every day. And we get our coffee and we read our books. We read all the therapy books. We read all the, like I said, we're reading Fight right now, the Gottman's new book. And we read them personally. Like, how does this apply to us individually? How does it apply to us as a couple? And then, we're teaching some of that material to other people. Like, I'm about to teach a class in January. I know this won't come out until after that, called Healing Through Relationship. And then I'm going to be starting a continuity program. The working title for that is Love School. um,
Mm.
for people that are in an ongoing attempt to use their relationships as their trauma healing, like as the portal, as both a sanctuary and refuge, but also a crucible, like an alchemical catalyst for bringing up all the unhealed parts, as our partners tend to do, to help us identify the parts in us that still need self to parts connection healing.
Mm. So
I
amazing.
don't know what else.
So many great
Nature.
resources.
Yeah, I
Oh,
spend
go
a
ahead.
ton of time in nature. I was going to say the other
Mm.
personal process is I spend a ton of time in nature,
And
like
define a ton of time.
um 2 to 3 hours a day.
Mm.
Yeah, outside on the beach, hiking in the mountains, sitting in my backyard. Yeah, I live on Highway 1 in California with redwoods and mountains and ocean and wild animals in a very rural area. We don't have a gas station or a grocery store anywhere in half an hour. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's another huge part for me is that sacred holding space of nature. That allows my parts to kind of come to the surface more readily. I don't do well in cities.
Hmm. How much of that? So I'm wondering, how much of that do you think is like a natural kind of introversion, that you need that downtime? Or like, I know my partner Claire, um, like she's definitely a highly sensitive person and needs that like recuperation time. How much of it do you think is that, or do you think most humans need a lot more time in nature? Or maybe it's both.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's both. I enjoy being around people. I definitely sort of get drained when I'm around a lot of people. Cities are just too much chaos. I was in San Francisco yesterday, and it's just like, oh yeah, this is. I get easily overstimulated. So it being in nature just helps me slow down the pace, and it's also I can tell the state of my nervous system shifts when I'm in New York City, for example, or when I'm walking on a trail in my backyard.
Mm.
Um, so I do think most humans are. I think a lot of humans are unaware. They're lacking in what we call interoception. They're not necessarily somatically aware when their nervous system is in a fight or flight sympathetic response or a dorsal vagal freeze or fawn kind of shutdown. I'm very sensitive to that. I can tell when my nervous system gets jacked up and I'm uncomfortable with that sensation. And so I can feel my whole system sort of drop into this, um, whether I'm with somebody in nature or whether I'm by myself, it's like this intimate relationship because I've lived here 16 years. I know all the flowers. I know all the animals. I know the ocean. I know the mountains. Like I'm very much an animist in my spirituality. So I feel like part of my own attachment style is it's really easy for me to attach to nature in ways
Mm.
that's much simpler than the attachments that I create with humans. I think
Mm.
a lot of people with their own trauma um, can relate to that, right? It's a safe attachment. So my nervous system can really drop into this space where I'm not disconnected. I don't feel lonely. I feel very connected. I feel connected to self. I feel connected to nature. I feel connected to whatever you'd call God. Um, and then it makes it easier for me to feel like I can feel connected to my parts in a compassionate and generous way. And then I feel more resourced to come back into relationships with other people in this generous way. That's not over generous. That's not giving tree generous, but is more reciprocal generosity.
Mm. What would you say to people that either, I don't want to say push back, but that they think they can't do 2 to 3 hours a day of time in nature, that they can't, spend that much time on themselves, whether it's because of phase of life. Maybe they have young kids and they're really busy with that phase of career. They're just getting started, or career shifting, or that they would say, well, that's great that you can do that. But that's just not realistic for myself. I think sometimes when I hear those kind of pushbacks, there is truth in there, but then there's also limiting beliefs as well. Like, what would you say if someone kind of pushed back in their mind, thinking, well, there's no way I could do that?
Well, it's totally valid. It's totally valid. It is absolutely a sign of my privilege and also a sign of my priorities. I used to work in a hospital. I was on call every third night. I worked 72-hour call shifts. I was living in a big city. I had two houses and two mortgages and a 401k. I don't have any of that anymore. I don't own any properties. I don't have a 401k. I have opted to live much more simply and earn much less money in order to prioritize that lifestyle. I used to feel trapped. I didn't I've never lived with anybody who's paid my bills. I was the full-time provider in my 13-year marriage with my daughter and her father. And after our divorce, I was the one sort of paying for private school and paying alimony and all of that. So I've never had like somebody else taking care of me financially in order to just give me that kind of lifestyle. But I have chosen a lifestyle that allows me that kind of thing. And I absolutely understand not everybody has that choice. And not everybody wants to choose that choice. They maybe are choosing financial security or home ownership or, more professional um, ambition or things like that. So I think that one of the things that I really came to recognize when I was in my integrative medicine practice, which I haven't been working clinically since 2010, which is part of why I can do that, um, is that a lot of times when you said the limiting beliefs, a lot of times when we think we don't have a choice, we actually do. The cage door is open. We just might have to make sacrifices that some of our parts might not want or let us make. And that's totally fine. And that's again why IFS can be such a useful tool when we're not sure. For example, if someone has chronic illness and thinks maybe part of it is relational trauma, for example, and they're thinking, gosh, that sounds great, spending all this time in IFS meditation, parts processing, going out in nature or whatever, but I don't have the time for that. This is where there's an IFS practice called the conference table that I really appreciate. Where, for example, I could ask inside, okay, who has an opinion about how much time we should be productive earning money and how much time we should be focusing on recovery, um, healing, nature, whatever. And you can just line the parts up on both sides of the table. And self is sitting at the front of the table like a mediator would to give voice to all the different parts and hear them out. They all have good intentions for you. They all have a protective purpose and they're all worth listening to. So I don't even like saying like limiting beliefs because that feels sort of insulting to some of my
Mm,
parts that hold those limiting beliefs. Like for those parts, those beliefs are fact, they're they're like when I believed that I couldn't leave the hospital, like that was a limiting belief. It turned out not to be fact. But the parts of me on the side of the table that said I could not leave the hospital were extremely dominant in my system because just practically speaking, for example, I had to pay $120,000 malpractice tail in order to quit my job. So I would not only
mm,
lose my income, I'd have to come up with $120,000 in cash and I still had medical school debt. So my financial parts were saying that is not an option to quit your job as a doctor. And I had no vision, even no potential on the horizon for how to make money in any other way. Um, so that felt like fact in my system, but in actuality, it wasn't fact. I had choices, but I had to make sacrifices that some parts of me really didn't want to make.
mm. Man, I feel like we could go on for another hour. Lissa, the last question I have for you is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
such a good question. I don't want to waste it with something not important enough. Um, I guess you said every private practitioner?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, if anybody listening is not familiar with internal family systems, the most valuable nugget of that, I think, is approaching your clients, even your most poorly behaving behaviors of your clients, through the lens of understanding that it's a survival style, that those behaviors are coming from parts that are trying to protect people from being overwhelmed by, feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, worthlessness, powerlessness, those really intolerable feelings that our most wounded inner children hold. And when we can approach them in a genuinely non-pathologizing way, like, to me, that's the how of self-compassion. And we can, as practitioners, we can hold that self-energy to entrain that kind of self-compassion in our clients. And that can be such a game changer.
Mm. So great. If people want to follow your work, if they want to learn more about your books, where should we send them?
My main website is just my name, LissaRankin.com, LissaRankin.com. And I also have a Substack where I'm specifically, I'm releasing 2 books that I've written but not published, for my paid subscribers. And I also have an unpaid offering there at lissarankinmd.substack.com. And that's all about boundaries and spiritual bypassing and things like that. So I do a lot of writing.
Mm. So awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the Practice of the Practice podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much. And thanks for sharing so much about what you're going through. I hope I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you and all your parts.
Thank you. Today is such a great example of how, a podcast is obviously for the listeners in some ways, that it's, helping you out. But, lately, just the amount of times that guests have just been so informative to me personally. A podcast can not just only change kind of the direction of your own career, but also just you as a person, to have access to just top thinkers that are doing amazing things in the world. If you're interested in starting a podcast or just learning more about podcasting, we have a bunch of free resources over at podcastlaunchschool.com that will be really helpful for you if you're thinking about starting a podcast or getting support around your podcast. Thank you so much to Alma for being our sponsor today. I wish Alma had been around when I had my private practice. I had no idea what I was doing. That's why I didn't take insurance. But if Alma had been there, I would have. And there's no reason that as a clinician, you should be spending hours on paperwork to bill for insurance, or not knowing for sure that you'll get reimbursed for sessions with your clients. If you're interested in seeing clients through insurance, but don't want to navigate the process and paperwork on your own, Alma can help. They make it easy to get credentialed with major insurance plans at enhanced reimbursement rates and a guaranteed payment within 2 weeks. Visit helloalma.com/Joe. That's hello, ALMA.com/Joe to get started. Thank you so much for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.